So hello everyone, my name is Amanda and I'm from Tamworth Library, and I would like to welcome you to our virtual In Conversation event with author Hugh Mackay and ABC New England Northwest Breakfast presenter Kristy Redding. If you have any questions for Hugh, just write them into the chat box, and at the end of the Q&A, Hugh will have the opportunity to answer them. We are also recording this session, so you can watch it later when we have placed it up on our library website and our social media platforms. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Gamilaroi people who are traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. I will now hand over to Kristy and Hugh. So welcome Kristy and Hugh, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, Hugh, well, now's my time to introduce you. I hope you're not too nervous.
Highly anxious.
Hugh Mackay is a social researcher and best-selling author of 21 books, including What Makes Us Tick, The Good Life, and Australia Reimagined. His latest non-fiction book, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, is The Inner Self, published in August of this year. Interestingly, concurrently with his 8th novel, The Question of Love, which we'll talk about right after The Inner Self. Hugh has a 60-year career in social research and was a weekly newspaper columnist for more than 25 years. And among many honorary appointments, he's been Deputy Chairman of the Australia Council for the Arts, Chairman of the Trustees of the Sydney Grammar School, and the inaugural chairman of the ACT Government's Community Inclusion Board, and an honorary professor of Macquarie, Wollongong and Charles Sturt Universities. Hugh, I'm just tired thinking about all of that.
Yes, I'm not sure how that all happened, but anyway, we'll put that behind us.
Yeah, first things first, of course, for those that are watching this, you'll be able to see both of Hugh's books over his shoulder. The first one we're going to talk about is The Inner Self, and as Amanda mentioned, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end of this. Hugh, this was the book that I read first out of the two, so we're going to start with this one. The Inner Self, the joy of discovering who we really are. Now, when I interviewed you during the week on my breakfast program, we talked about the concept of inner self and discovery, and I suppose a level of nervousness that can come with that. People, do they really want to know their inner self? Do they really want to know who they really are? I suppose I'd like you firstly to explain this idea that you talk about in your book of personal identity. How do you define that or describe that?
Yes, thank you, Kristy, and hello, everybody. I'm sorry I can't be there in person and we can all make eye contact, but it's lovely to have you via Zoom joining in. When we talk about the self, there are two separate bits to the self. Eventually, we hope they merge and combine, but we all have an external outer shell, which we think of as our personal identity. It's very fashionable at the moment to talk about identity, isn't it? Even through to identity politics. So what do we mean by personal identity? Well, that's a kind of social construction. That's how people see us, how they identify us, and in particular, how they distinguish between us. So personal identity is all about our differences. How is Kristy different from Hugh? And we can talk about that in terms of gender or ethnicity or age or job or any dimension of the me that appears in the world. So the social identity is all about me as an independent person, unique, different from everybody else. And typically in the first half of our lives, sometimes it's not as long as that, but typically for the first 30 or 40 years of our lives, most of us are primarily concerned about establishing our personal identity, not worrying too much about the inner self, but kind of getting our toehold on the planet, establishing ourselves, maybe choosing a partner, maybe deciding whether or not to have kids, perhaps choosing a job, buying a house, furnishing it, making all sorts of statements about our personal identity, about the kind of person we want to be in the world. But there comes a point, and it often is around about, the classic midlife crisis is often about this, Kristy. Comes a point where sometimes we think, well, that isn't all there is to me. I'm not just the way I appear to other people. All those things about my identity are not the sum total of who Kristy is or who Hugh is. In fact, I started the book with a little story, a quote from the British actor Emma Thompson, who on the eve of her 60th birthday, so it was coming a bit later for her than a midlife crisis, but on the eve of her 60th birthday, she said in an interview with Time magazine that she'd reached a point in her life where she could take away all the roles and responsibilities that people had thrust on her, whether a daughter, mother, wife, actor, celebrity, etc., as though they were masks. And she said you could take those things away from your face and ask the question, but who am I really? And Emma Thompson said in that interview, I used to think that was a really boring question, but now I've decided that it's absolutely fascinating. And I think that sometimes does take perhaps a 60th birthday, but more often maybe a 40th birthday, perhaps a 50th, or a bereavement or a retrenchment or something more cheerful like the birth of a baby or falling in love, or all kinds of things can trigger this thought or this question, who am I really? It's often associated though with a moment in your life when you think there's more to life than this, and there's more to me than I've appeared. So this is a very long answer to your question, but that's the point where we turn inwards, look more deeply inside ourselves, and perhaps we can explore this a bit more in a moment, but the essence of what happens is that whereas our personal identity is all about the externals and how we appear, when we look more deeply into ourselves, we find not our uniqueness, but we find our sense of common humanity. So whereas the personal identity is all about me and my independence, the inner self, the deep core of who we are, is more about how we're interconnected, how the fact that we are humans is the most, and members of this species interconnected with each other, is the most significant thing about us, even though all the personal identity stuff, all the individual differences between us seem often to be the most interesting thing about us, they're not the most important thing.
Okay, we're going to talk in a moment about the 20 hiding places, or we'll go through a few of these hiding places that you think we're tucked away, living a comfortable life underneath. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but yes. I'd like to know a bit more about the benefits of discovering our inner self. I'm sure there are people that just go through life never really discovering their inner self, or not really getting too deep into discovering their inner self. But what are the benefits of discovering one's inner self?
Well, it's all about authenticity, Kristy. I think when we finally step away from the image that we project and the outer, not abandon it, but look behind it, look beneath it. And plenty of people are reluctant to, in case they don't like what they find. But when we do that, when we get in touch with our deep sense of humanity, we become a more authentic person. And generally speaking, people who have this moment of enlightenment when they realize, gosh, the most important thing about me is that I'm human, not that I'm Hugh. It's like enlightenment. It's like liberation. It's as I said in the subtitle of the book, it's the joy of discovering who we are. It is like psychological freedom to say, now I get this about myself. And of course, what I get in that moment of enlightenment, what I get is not just, oh yes, I'm a human being, but I get that because I'm a human being, I have at the very core of my being, the one quality that we need in order to maintain the health of the species, in order to preserve social cohesion, in order to maintain communities, groups, families, of all collections of all kinds that we belong to. And that quality is, of course, compassion. That's the defining human quality, regardless of whether it's you with all your particular personal identity dimensions or me with mine. What we both share, and we share it with every human on the planet, is this remarkable human capacity to be kind and respectful towards each other, which is, I say, the one quality we need in order to, because we're social beings, we're hopeless in isolation. We need each other. We need groups, communities, families, workplace colleagues, friendship circles, all of that in order to nurture us and sustain us and give us a sense of emotional security. So this quality of compassion is the absolute core of human nature. Of course, there are other less attractive features. In fact, before we talk about the hiding places, it's probably important to say, or to use a metaphor that I use in the book, which I find quite useful, other people might find useful, to think of compassion, this wonderful quality at our core, which, by the way, has got nothing to do with affection. It's not an emotional thing. It's just being true to our human nature. We can be compassionate towards people we don't even like or could never agree with. We can be kind to strangers. You know, this is a remarkable thing about humans. We have this capacity. But if we think of that as being like the sun at the center of our personal solar system, then just like the literal sun, compassion creates shadows. Those are places where we can hide from the sun, where we can hide from, because I mean, it's wonderful that we as humans have this quality, this capacity to be compassionate, but it's also a burden. It's also a demand that's made on us. To be fully human is to be a compassionate, caring, kind, respectful person towards everyone else we meet, because they're part of us. But no one pretends that's easy. So we often do find ourselves hiding in the shadows that are cast by this bright light of compassion at the center.
All right. Can we delve into some of these shadows, as you just described it, Ben? Some of these hiding places. And I feel like there's perhaps a lot that we could talk about it. There's 20, as I mentioned, when it comes to these hiding places. Is there any particular, Hugh, that you'd like to talk about? I've got a couple here that I thought maybe we could look at information technology in the year of 2020, particularly in a pandemic year as well.
Yes, well, that's a good one to start with. In fact, we might also talk about busyness, which is a current favourite. And I'd also like to talk about projection. We can come to that. That's an almost universal human hiding place. But yeah, let's start with information technology. And this is a good example, actually, Kristy, of the way these hiding places work, because these places are only hiding. These things we do are only hiding places if we're actually hiding in them. I mean, there's nothing wrong with information technology. There's nothing wrong with being busy. It's only if we are hiding from the demands of love, of compassion in these places. For example, if our use of the smartphone becomes addictive, where we just can't bear not to have it in our hand and to be scrolling through it in every spare moment, that's a sign, it's a warning signal to us that we are probably hiding. In other words, we are keeping ourselves permanently distracted from the inner self, from our inner life, by being endlessly stimulated by what's on the smartphone or in the social media or the news feed or whatever it is we're using as a way of distracting ourselves. Now, of course, as you say, in the pandemic, information technology has been the saving of us. So we haven't been hiding in it. we've been using it many of us have been using it as a lifeline to maintain contact with friends and family, and to do the kind of thing we're doing right now, which is chatting to a group of people in Tamworth when I can't actually be in Tamworth. So it's brilliant. And we're very lucky that we're experiencing a global pandemic at a time when, in contrast with previous pandemics and plagues and other things like this in human history, when there was no way of keeping in touch with people. So this is not to condemn social media or information technology in general, but simply to say, when it gets out of hand, when we find that we just have to be constantly connected, that's a problem. And in fact, there's some interesting research was published by the Australian Psychological Society, which I've quoted in the book, just a couple of years ago, showing that among the heaviest users of social media, or the heaviest users of social media experience the highest levels of loneliness. So we've got this odd category now where we talk about people who are connected but lonely. And what that's describing, I think, is people who've become so enamored of their information technology that it's happening at the expense of their connection, their human, face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball connection with other people. And so even though they're connected, even though they're drowning in an absolute torrent of data, and they're exchanging messages with everyone, almost 24 hours a day, they're experiencing human loneliness, and that's a sign that they have hidden from their inner self, which is all about our connectedness, hidden in the information technology. So coming out of the pandemic, I think we'll all need to be a bit alert to the fact that, sure, it's very easy for me to sit in my office at home and for everyone to be just sitting at home having a Zoom meeting like this, and no doubt in the future we'll want to do this occasionally, but the difference between what happens when we are face-to-face, when we can actually make eye contact rather than pretending eye contact via Zoom, and when we can give someone a friendly pat on the shoulder or a kiss on the cheek, or all the wonderful stuff that happens when human beings are in the same place at the same time. We lose all that, of course, when we're resorting to information technology. So it's very much a second best. But people who use it as a hiding place feel as though that's their natural habitat, and they become the kind of people who would rather send a text or make a Facebook post than actually have a conversation.
Right, Hugh. Let's keep pushing on. Let's talk a bit about busyness now. Yeah.
Yes, busyness is another classic hiding place for some people, although, as I keep emphasising, it doesn't have to be. Some people are just busy because that's what life's dealt them at the moment, and they are very busy. And
some people wear it like a badge of honour, Hugh.
Well, we do praise busyness in our culture. In fact, have you noticed, Kristy, that we used to say in Australia, "How are you going? All right?" Now we tend to say, "How are you going? Busy?" As though, come on, are you busy? Is the switch on or off? Are you busy or are you dead? As though if you're not busy, what's wrong with you? Well, busyness is a great barrier to social cohesion. Busyness is a way. I mean, again, I emphasize some people are trapped in busyness for certain periods of their lives. But when people seem to be obsessively busy, they go on too many committees and they're always at the computer, all that sort of stuff. You have to ask yourself, what are they hiding from? How come the treadmill is running so hard? Because if the treadmill is running so fast, we don't then have time. We don't have the opportunity or the inclination to ask, why are we running so hard? Why are we so busy? Why are we allowing ourselves to take on so many commitments? because we probably know that the answer would be a bit painful for us, that we are doing all this as a way of avoiding or postponing that encounter with the self that we truly are.
All right, Hugh, let's talk about projection now.
Yes, projection. This is probably one of the greatest of all human hiding places, and has been throughout history. And various religions talk about this. It's quite a big theme in Christianity. It's a big theme in mystics and thinkers through the centuries. But projection, it's become the subject of intense psychological investigation in the 20th century. But projection is the human tendency to blame others for things that we suspect are wrong with us, or criticizing others for frailties or flaws that we actually have. It's a way of denying some truth about our inner life by criticizing. So, for example, you might say to someone, "Oh, you know, she's obsessed with her smartphone," as a way of deflecting the investigation into the question of whether I might be obsessed with my smartphone. I mean, it's a good way of not dealing with an issue, by criticizing someone else for having that same issue. In the Christian context, there's a story in the New Testament of Jesus talking about how can you criticize the speck in another person's eye when you've got a great log in your own eye. In other words, you know, we are often blinding ourselves to our own failings or frailties by perceiving them in other, not just perceiving them, but criticizing them in other people. When I mean, it's not a bad little rule of life to say, when something about other people really intensely annoys us or makes us angry or gets us really worked up, first thing to do is to pause and look inside and say, maybe, do I have this problem? Am I so angry with that person about something that I want to criticize, or so critical of them for something, because I'm trying to avoid confronting the same problem in myself? It's a very clever hiding place.
There is 20 hiding places, as I mentioned. I'd love to get through all of them, but we need to push on time-wise, Hugh. But yes. If people are reading this book, or even just listening right now, and perhaps have identified with a couple of the hiding places we've discussed, how do we begin addressing these hiding places and working towards emerging from them?
Yes, it does require a bit of courage. I mean, one of the things, some readers have found this quite a challenging book for this reason, because obviously if we found a comfortable hiding place, why would we want to abandon it? You know, if we're getting away with being a workaholic and people are actually praising us for our devotion to our work, you know, why would we want to step away from it and say that's, you know, that was actually a hiding place? But I think it's the promise of authenticity that should draw us out of hiding, and not just that we will feel better about ourselves when we've confronted the fact that we've allowed ourselves to be trapped in, because it's like a little prison, trapped in our busyness or in our projection or in our devotion to information technology or in our materialism or our work or whatever it might be. It's not just that we become more authentic and have this experience of psychological freedom. It's actually, and this is pretty much an ironclad guarantee, it's also very good for our personal relationships. It's very hard for people to have an authentic relationship with someone who is in hiding. When we become more truly ourselves, and in particular, embrace this core quality of human nature, this capacity we all have for compassion and kindness and so on, we become far more attractive humans. More, you know, you often hear people saying, I never felt I could get through to him. And what I think people are saying when they make remarks like that is, I just never felt this person was quite authentic. They weren't really open to me. And sometimes you hear in a friendship or even in a partnership, in a marriage, one partner will reveal something about the fact that they've never really liked X, or they've always wanted to do Y, whatever it is, and their partner has said, why didn't you tell me? And often we are reluctant to come out of hiding and be more authentically ourselves because we fear that people who might have loved us or accepted us for the externals, and if they know more about what's going on inside us, they mightn't love us. The answer almost always is exactly the opposite. They're much more likely to love us when we reveal some of our doubts, some of our frailties, some of our difficulties we've had in coming to terms with our inner self.
Do you think at one point in a lot of people's lives they've had a hiding place? Whether it's our neighbours, whether it's our partners, whether it's people we walk past in the supermarket. Do you think everyone has at least one hiding place?
I think we all have hidden at some time. Actually, I think it does change through age. There's a very interesting graph based on global research about people's sense of well-being. It's a U curve, which shows that through adolescence and early adulthood, through to our middle years, our sense of life satisfaction tends to decline, and then it tends to increase as we get older. So people often are experiencing a richer life, deeper life satisfaction in their 50s, 60s, and 70s than they did in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think that's to do with this very point, Kristy. I think we all do hide, but there comes a point where we come out of hiding, where we are much more open about our true feelings, because we've understood that really we can only make sense of who we are through our relationships with other people. And if they are inauthentic, if we're pretending, if we're not being transparent and true to who we really are, then the whole thing is a bit of a waste of time. And I think at a certain point in our lives, we think, well, no more time for this. Let's get to the heart of who we are. Let's be truly ourselves. And that makes us more relaxed. It makes us more tolerant, makes us more patient with other people. And these, of course, are all lovely human qualities that are byproducts of the compassionate self.
I'm just conscious of the time, so I just thought we might move now on to your novel, Question of Love. And of course, as Amanda mentioned at the start, if you're joining us late, you do have an opportunity to post any questions in the chat as well. So if we're talking and you're thinking, oh, I'd love to know more about this, or I want to ask that, I'm sure Amanda would be grateful to see the questions pop up in the chat, and she's going to collate them, and we'll do a bit of a Q&A at the end as well. So Hugh, your other book, a novel, The Question of Love, which has come out at the same time as The Inner Self. Now, this was a decision by your publisher to do this. Can you tell us a bit about how they perhaps complement each other?
Yes. The novel was written, I started writing the novel about 4 years ago. It was an attempt, it came from two places. I'd long had the idea that I'd love to try and write a novel which was a kind of literary version of the classical music theme and variations format, which is roughly the same as the sort of jazz improvisation format, where you establish a theme at the beginning and you restate the theme at the end, but in between you go off on all sorts of variations and improvisations. I thought, wouldn't it be fun to write a novel in which the first and last chapters are the same, but in all the intervening chapters we learn a lot more about what's really going on. So when we, as in music, when we hear the theme the second time, it makes much more sense to us. So that was a sort of structural idea I had, but then I also had an idea for a novel based on a very, very intense, almost forensic, it's like a social researcher's dream, a kind of forensic examination of a relationship, a marriage in this case between Richard, an architect, and Freya, a violinist. So I thought, okay, I want to tell this story. This is the opportunity to use the theme and variation structure. So I brought these two ideas together and I started working on it, as I say, about 4 years ago. It was quite a tricky challenge to work the theme and variation structure, or to make it work. So I played with it for about 3 years, or a couple of years. And then I started talking to the publisher about my new non-fiction, which became The Inner Self. And I said, you know, I've got this novel also, which is basically ready to go. I'd been talking to them about the novel for years. And then when they read the final version and looked at what I was proposing to do with The Inner Self, they said, this is like a case study of some of the themes in The Inner Self. This is a couple who are not only hiding from themselves, but they're hiding from each other. And gradually, as we move through the book, some of the layers are peeled away and we learn more about them and they learn more about each other. Why don't we hold this and bring it out as a sort of companion to The Inner Self? So I don't know whether it was a brave decision or a courageous decision in the Yes Minister sense, but they literally came out on the same day, on the 11th of August, bang. The two books appeared and people assumed that I'd written two books at once, you know, one with my right hand and one with my left hand. Not at all, I'm not that.
You're not ambidextrous? Well, Hugh, let's talk a bit about this, the question of love. You've given a great summary there of the way that this book is constructed. But I really enjoyed, and I've only kind of just finished this over the weekend. This was obviously the second book I read as part of this, but I loved the complexities and also the contradictions. I found it, dare I say, a little reassuring to watch both Richard and Freya's different views of how they perceived what was going on in their relationships. It actually made me feel, yes, somewhat reassured in a way to know that the way we all see relationships, whether romantic or otherwise, can be perceived differently, and sometimes that's okay.
Yes, yes, it's interesting. That's a lovely response, Kristy. Thank you. And I've heard some other readers of the novel say that there's nothing quite as reassuring as to get a really intense look at someone else's relationship to reassure you about the state of your own relationships. You know, at least we're not doing that, or we are doing that. It was a very, you know, I think one of the things that occurred to me as I was writing it, and I kind of got to know the characters better as the story went on, is something that I think a lot of couples can relate to, which is Richard in particular. I mean, it was a problem for both of them, but Richard in particular had enormous trouble in speaking really openly to Freya about how important she is to him. You know, this is a funny thing. There's a meditative chapter towards the end where Richard is home on his own. Freya is out having a rehearsal with the string quartet she belongs to. And Richard is trying to wander around the house feeling a bit bereft because she's not there and there's only the dog for company. And he's saying, you know, the most important thing about my work is that Freya likes it. You know, the most important thing about a building I've designed is that Freya approves of it or is inspired by it or something, but she probably doesn't realize that. And then it kind of dawns on him, she probably doesn't realize that because I've never actually told her. And she similarly has various things that she can't tell him. She says, you know, my mother used to say really warm and loving things to my father. I don't seem to be able to talk like that to Richard. And at one point, Richard comes home and Freya and Angelina, who's a daughter from Richard's first marriage, is there visiting them. And in front of Angelina, Freya says, "Hello, darling," to Richard, and they're both a bit shocked because she never calls him darling.
Yes.
But when the daughter is there, she's able to. I mean, it's an odd thing about how the barriers we create between ourselves, even in intimate relationships, where there are some things that the partner would be yearning to hear, that we're curiously reluctant to say. And often we do need a bit of a crisis, and they are having a bit of a crisis over the question of whether they're going to have a baby, etc. We do need a crisis to bring out some of these things that might otherwise be left unsaid. In fact, in the second last chapter of the book, which is called If Only, we're alternating between the two voices, and each of them is saying, you know, if only Richard could do this, and if only Freya was this kind of person. So, and yet, when they've been through this whole litany of ways in which they wish the other one was different, they come at the end really, well, we don't want to give too much away about what they can, but they certainly are committed to going on, and they, you know, perfection isn't possible, but this is maybe as good as it gets.
Yeah. Richard in this book is, I think there are touches of what could be described as a stereotypical male in this, and Freya the same. You know, there are certain stereotypes, touches of the stereotypes,
yes,
of what a woman is expected to be as well. So I think a lot of people will be able to relate to the characters in some way or many ways, depending on their circumstances. Why do you think, I suppose, these books complement each other so well? And what do you hope, if people are reading these concurrently, what do you hope people walk away from?
Well, I hope certainly that people who've read both books will feel that the inner self was like a key that unlocked a lot of the problems that Richard and Freya are having, that it does explain from a psychological point of view what's actually happening in the marriage. I mean, one of the things that happens as we move through the novel, I don't know if this was your experience, Kristy, it was my experience writing it, that Richard starts out as a rather pompous kind of character, potentially a bit boring, a bit emotionally cold and aloof and so on. But gradually, it's not so much that he changes, because he keeps saying many of the same things time after time after time. But gradually, we learn more about his story. And the more we learn about what's actually happened to him, what shaped him, I think the more sympathetic we become, or that I did in writing him, the more sympathetic we become to why he is the way he is. And I think that's what I would hope with people who do read both books, that the inner self, not just in the case of Richard and Freya, but more generally, will help us to understand a bit more about why we are the way we are and why we do hide in these various hiding places. Richard and Freya each criticize the other for hiding in their busyness.
So fructans.
And we can, I think, sympathise with both sides of that story.
Okay, well, Hugh, I think we've got through a lot there in the half an hour or so that we were allocated. We've got a little bit over time, but we were a little bit late to start as well. So thank you for your time and delving into these two very different but complementary books. So we appreciate your time very much.
Thank you very much, Kristy.
I'm going to hand back over to Amanda now from the Tamworth City Library, who's going to talk us through a bit of a Q&A. So I'll hand over to Amanda now.
Thank you, Hugh and Kristy. That was great. So I'm just going to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Hugh, just to write them in the chat box and I will read them out to Hugh. So I'll just check to see if we have anything. So we don't have any questions so far from the audience, but I have two questions for both Hugh and Kristy. So while everybody's busy typing, I will start the questions off. So Hugh, what are you currently reading at the moment, and what book would you recommend to our viewers?
Well, I've just finished reading. I'm a devoted reader of fiction. I think fiction is a shortcut to understanding human nature. I think we learn much more about how humans interact from reading novels than we do from reading psychology textbooks. But curiously, the book that I've just finished reading is not fiction. But the new book by Julian Barnes, whose fiction I really love, but this is a book called The Man in the Red Coat, which is a story about Paris at the turn of the 20th century, La Belle Époque, the story about the writers, the artists, the dandies, the doctors, the aristocrats, who were all interacting in Paris at the turn of the century. Barnes, of course, is not only a wonderful novelist, but he's also a bit of an art historian and also a Francophile. So this brings together his novel writing skill with his historical understanding of France and of art. So I found it an absolutely engrossing read, even though it wasn't fiction. The most recent novel I've read is the latest Elizabeth Strout, and I'm a great Elizabeth Strout fan, called Lucy Again, Olive Again, the sequel to Olive Kettridge, which is a wonderful book.
Great.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, not the last book I read, but Olive Again was the book prior to the last one. So I'm there with you on that one, Hugh. The last book, well, the current book that I'm reading at the moment is Where the Crawdads Sing.
Oh, I love that book.
Owens. So I'm probably 3/4 of the way through. So I'm hoping to be at the end of that by the time I start holidays at the end of next week. And then a book that I would probably suggest, and this is probably quite timely because he's got a brand new book out, would be Trent Dalton, Boy Swallows Universe, because his latest book, All Our Shimmering Skies, is just out this month, I think. Is that right, Amanda?
Came out yesterday.
Oh, yesterday. Yeah, okay. So Boy Swallows Universe was probably a favourite of mine from last year. And yeah, I think I'll be starting All Our Shimmering Skies. I'll go and get my hands on that to start my holiday. But yeah, Where the Crawdads Sing is the last book that I read, and yeah, really enjoyed that one. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, it looks like we have some questions, so I'll bring those up. So we've got one from Wayne. Hugh, you may have referenced this in the first half of your talk. I didn't have audio. Which of your 2 new books would you recommend to read first?
Yes, that's interesting. I must say I have spoken to a couple of people who have read them simultaneously, and I've kind of had both books on the go. I think that's probably a bit ambitious. I'd be inclined to read the novel first. First of all, it's shorter and easier, lighter, but also then coming to the inner self with the novel in mind, I think it will enrich the experience of having read the novel. But other people, I mean, people who just love non-fiction will obviously read. Kristy, you read The Inner Self first, I think, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
So, you know, it really is a matter of personal preference. But if I were, because I love fiction, both reading it and writing it, I would go for the novel first, and then get the backstory from The Inner Self.
Okay, so another question from Jenny. Would you have written these books 10 years ago? Are the characters archetypes or people you've known?
Ah, what a fascinating question. I certainly, no, I wouldn't have written them 10 years ago. I wasn't ready to write The Inner Self 10 years ago. I was still very immersed in social research, and so the whole idea of people's social identity and all that stuff. This is a more reflective book, which I suppose comes at a more reflective stage of my life. The novel, it's not conscious. I tend to accept what I've heard other people say about characters in fiction, which is all the characters are aspects of the author. And I certainly don't consciously borrow from people I know. I wouldn't say that I know a Richard or I know a Freya, although a friend of mine rang me yesterday, actually the widow of an old friend of mine, to say, oh, there's a lot of him in that book. Did you base did you base Richard on X, her late husband, my old friend? And I hadn't. But who knows? I mean, unconsciously, these things obviously do come to the surface. Then there are aspects of people I know or have known that are bound to find their way in terms of mannerisms and little turns of phrase and so on. But the actual character, I think there's probably nowhere for a novelist to hide. The character has got to be some aspect of me, or it wouldn't ring true in the way that those characters rang true for Kristy.
Great. So do we have any more questions for Hugh?
I wish I could now sign copies of the book for you, but anyway, that'll happen another time.
Yes, hopefully in 2020 we can see everybody back at the library for our events.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank both Hugh and Kristy for joining us tonight and all our audience participants. I'd like to remind the audience that the video recording will be available to watch again via our library website or our social media platforms. Hugh's books can also be reserved from our library website, which is www.cnrl.newsouthwales.gov.au. You can also purchase copies of Hugh's books from Collins Booksellers. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And again, I hope to see everyone in person in 2020 for our events. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you also, Kristy, for the conversation. It was wonderful. Thanks for organising it, Amanda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
No worries. Bye-bye.
Bye.